Our keynote speaker is Dr. Bernard Rose, who is serving as Assistant Vice President of Academics. He's Associate Professor of Education and Director of the Master's Program in Educational Design and Technology at Concordia University, Wisconsin. He apparently, after our meeting this morning, I know that this is his second time in Lincoln. He once looked at UNL and thought we were too good for him. And so he chose to go somewhere else. He really, we talked about this morning as well, he speaks many languages. He speaks Mac and Windows, but he also speaks a variety of other kinds of languages, which makes him, I think, an exceptional choice for this conference. He speaks both education and technology. He taught in a middle school, social studies, which makes it close to my heart personally, and then in a high school, and then moved his way into higher education. And when you look at the list of presentations he's made in the last few years, I got tired just from reading it. Just this year, he's presented 8 times in 8 different places, so it's really an exciting life you lead. I'll read you a few of the topics that he talks about, and I love just the way he's framed them. Cultivating high-impact communities of purpose and possibility captured my imagination. Self-directed learning, open learning environments, digital citizenship, the diffusion of innovation in learning environments, and disruptive innovation in education. There's a lot more, and if you're interested, we'll put all of that information up on our website. Without further ado, please welcome Bernard.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to spend a little bit of time with you today. I'll share that I approached this topic from a little bit of a different perspective. When I first got into the field of educational technology, I actually didn't get into the field of educational technology. I applied to 2 doctoral programs. One was the history of science at UW-Madison, and the second was instructional technology at Northern Illinois University. I got accepted into both, and really because I wasn't ready to go to step out of the classroom, I decided to go the more applied route to instructional technology. And then my goal was to subvert that program into a history of science program. And so most of my research had to do with the history and philosophy of technology. My first presentation was at a regional educational technology conference of administrators, mostly in the Chicagoland. And my presentation was on the negative impact of technology in education. I had a line of software vendors grimacing at me in the back of the room, just waiting for the Q&A. And boy, did I get it. So I approached this, I really did. My first number of years of research had to do with the dangers of technology, some of the social and ethical implications. And I think those are really important topics to explore. So as I got into that perspective, and I had more and more conversations, it became rather clear to me that this concept of technological innovation isn't going anywhere, that it will continue to have an impact in our schools and in our communities and our society at large. And that I can either continue to go what seemed to be a little bit more the Amish route, or I could get a little more engaged in the conversation and see if I might be able to curb it in positive ways. That's how I got involved in this. The more I got into it, the more I saw the promising possibilities of technology in this digital age in which we find ourselves. And that's what I'd like to explore with you a little bit today. So, the first slide here may conjure up some images for some of you. How many of you have seen this film? All right. Does anyone remember this scene?
Oh, yeah.
Does anyone recall what was happening in this scene? Someone want to give it a shot?
Dorothy has just arrived over the rainbow, and pretty soon those little flowers are going to pop up in their heads underneath, and then Glinda will come down and introduce herself.
Okay, now this is just as she arrives in this strange land. Does anyone remember the first thing that she says?
Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Okay. Almost. Anyone want to take another shot at it? It's very close.
It's Toto. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. I just saw this movie 2 days ago.
Yes, so the first statement is she looks around, she sees this, and she says, Toto, she's talking to her dog, yes, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. And then something else happens. This translucent figure kind of appears. And she replies, she says a second thing to Toto. Toto, now I know we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, some of you have never known life outside of Kansas. Some of you have grown up in the digital world that we'll name Kansas right now. Others of you are maybe just stepping into it. You're somewhere along the yellow brick road. Maybe you're at this very moment right now where you've just appeared, or maybe that experience will happen today during this session or during some of the sessions afterward. I'll suggest that even if you've grown up in the world of Kansas, this is a shape-shifting world. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a series of fantasy and science fiction pieces, and one of them in Paralandra, there are these islands that are ever shifting day after day. So you don't have this stable home. And we live in a digital world where things are shifting and shape-shifting on us all the time. So even if you grew up in this world, you will have a number of these experiences, like Dorothy. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. I know we're not in Kansas anymore. So when I usually present, a lot of the time I'm dealing with social and ethical issues. And I just can't let go of all of that. We're going to spend most of our time on learning environments. But just to give you a little bit of the we're not in Kansas anymore experience, some of you may have seen this. This is an older video. I'd like to just play this for you.
Grade 5 please, camera's rolling, and the recording sound. It's slated for Sounds good.
So as you look at this, let me pose one question for you. The person in the billboard at the end, was that a real person? Let's have a vote. How many of you say, yes, it was a real person? How many of you say, no? Well, I guess any picture is not a real person, right? It's a picture. Was that an accurate representation of a real person? So we live in an interesting world, don't we? This is a world where we have the ability to manipulate and experiment with the way in which we're perceived and seen, the way in which we see other people in new and amazing ways. There's also research coming out about how, for the first time, we're able to recreate images and interactive figures that look just like us, and we can have conversations with ourselves. And there are psychologists doing studies on how does that impact our sense of identity. And people are exploring ways to use that for therapy, to help people overcome certain habits and the like. We are not in Kansas anymore. One more.
Hey, Sarah.
Oh my gosh, he's so cute. How do you know him?
Come on, Donovan, do it like I taught you. Love the new tattoo, Sarah. Let's go!
Dude, look. Dude, that's Sarah.
The girl in the pink shirt, that's the girl I was telling you about.
Oh, that's Sarah?
Theater 2 on your left. Hey, Sarah. What color underwear today?
Okay, so here's one that many of our schools and learning organizations have begun to grapple with this idea that we have the digital world and we have a group of young people who are using it in a lot of different ways. They're very confident with the technical aspects of these tools, and yet they're still learning to manage their identity in these worlds, right? I always encourage teachers who feel a little bit outside, left out of the digital world, that you do have something to offer. Even if you don't know how to use the tools, you have wisdom to offer that's greatly needed as young people are growing up and learning to grapple with all of these different things. So we're not in Kansas anymore. Now, I would suggest, though, that as much as we have these things happening in the digital world, we can really learn a lot about how to design some really effective and engaging learning experiences by just studying the digital world. I approach most of my research using the tools of an anthropologist or sociologist. I study digital ethnography. I spent months studying Second Life, an online virtual world, looking at the ways in which people represent themselves. I was especially interested in studying spiritual communities, Buddhist temples, and other ways in which different religious groups represent themselves. It's interesting to see a nativity right in front of the red light district in Second Life. Yes, they have red light districts there. And so when I look at this, I'm looking at it as a sociocultural phenomenon. So let me take you through a couple more just items. How many of you have used this site or seen it before? Couch surfing. Now this is a new way of traveling. So if you were young, and this isn't just for young people, but years ago if you were young and on a limited budget and you wanted to travel the world, how would you do it? What's that? Okay, you could hitchhike. And also, youth hostels were very affordable, and they still are. People make good use of youth hostels. I still use them whenever I run some marathons, and I always look there if I'm in another city. Nice, inexpensive options, and you meet people from around the world. But now we have another kind of thing. This couch surfing, this is a community that you can join. You put in some information about yourself. There's a level of security where you share a bit about your identity. You notice I do have a profile in couch surfing. And there are discussions, topics about just various areas of interest, and you can open up your house to people from around the world. So say I'm traveling to Germany, maybe I'm going to a particular city, I can look on Couchsurfing and see if there's anyone in that city that is opening their house up to me for free. And I can contact them and say, hey, will you be around this Wednesday evening? I'm going to be coming through town. And they'll say yes or no, and I go over, and we hang out, we have a glass of wine, or a beer, or go out for dinner, or they just let me have a bed. And it's a really interesting kind of exchange. And you can follow the ways in which people interact. Now the reason I share this aspect of the digital world is because oftentimes when I speak with audiences who are concerned about the digital world, one of the first things that they express concern over is the ways in which technology separates us from one another. The way in which we're not communicating with one another as much as we used to. And I would suggest that we are communicating in new and different ways, but oftentimes as much or more than we ever did before. Sometimes people talk about the idea that, well, young people aren't able to communicate face-to-face as well as they could before. It's just as much of a concern if someone in the work environment of the digital age can't communicate online. That's as much of their work. In fact, one of the things that I'm studying right now are online communities of practice in different disciplines. Historians, of all people, you have the old school image of historians who sit in a room of dusty books alone and they do their work and they keep it secret until they publish it. And that's not how it's working. Even among historians, there are what are called collaboratories of historians who share all their data online and they collaborate with one another. They share their findings before they publish them and they interact and give each other feedback. That's a completely different way of working and interacting than what we saw even 10 years ago. There are PhD programs in history that are just beginning to grapple with how they have to change their curriculum in order to address these sorts of things. So we have the social web, which is key. And as I looked at the different presentations throughout the day, I think you're going to see a lot about the social web. Here's an example of a collaboratory, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which has detailed records of slave trades that are all shared in a common place. And historians and middle school students alike can make a use of this data to analyze it and to learn about the slave trade. So, here's what I'd like to do. That's my little introduction, the world in which we live. We're not in Kansas anymore. But now back to this idea of learning environments. I'd like to suggest that the learning environment of the future, and by future I mean 5 minutes from now, there are 3 things that I'm going to suggest that we might want to consider. And they're considerations to move beyond where maybe many of our learning environments are right now. Some environments are into this and well beyond it already. But I think these, I hope these, will be increasingly evident and present. And the first one is beyond the integrating technology model. Already back in the 1990s, we saw literature coming out talking about the importance of integrating technology in the classroom. I wouldn't argue against it. I mean, I'm at a conference that's exploring this idea of integrating technology. And yet, I think this model has some limitations that will really hold us back if we want to move forward and make full use of the digital age. If you look at this picture, what do you see? Anyone?
A lot of people on the side looking at the people in the middle.
A lot of people on the sides looking at those in the middle.
Smaller clumps and individuals.
What was that?
Smaller clumps and individuals.
Okay, smaller clumps of individuals. Neither of those first 2 responses were, I see a technology called a swimming pool. I wonder what kind of filter they use in that. Right? We didn't jump to the technical, we jumped to the social. We identified that this is a social environment. The integrating technology model, at its worst, overemphasizes the technology and doesn't pay adequate attention to the social dynamic that's critical to learning. So that's one of the limitations I think that we want to explore moving forward. Think about it this way. This makes it kind of interesting. Anyone a coach in here? Football coaches or basketball, volleyball, anything? If you're a coach, or if you were ever a player on a team, do you remember this exchange at the beginning of the year? Okay, team, we're ready for another great week. Now our goal is to integrate as much technology into our team as possible. Or how about dating? Or you're married and you are you're hanging out and things just seem a little bit stale and you say, things just aren't working so well here. I think we really need to integrate more technology into our relationship. We just don't do that, right? Well, maybe we do. If we texted more, we would be much closer. Yeah. Now, I was actually speaking to a group of pastors out in Connecticut last year, and a pastor did come up to me and he said one of the first things he had to do in dealing with a counseling situation was that there was a husband and wife, and he said, well, have you guys tried to talk through this? And he said, sort of. Well, what do you mean? Well, she's on one side of the room, I'm on the other, and we text back and forth in the same space. That's a new dynamic for arguing. Okay, so I'm going to argue that we don't want to just we don't want to just integrate technology for technology's sake. That would be a significant limitation. It wouldn't really push us forward. Now let's bracket that for a second. Does anyone know what this is? I share this image in many presentations. I use it for different kinds of illustrations. Anyone know what this is? Anyone want to guess? A what? A chainsaw. Okay?
An egg beater.
An egg beater. Okay? Once you hear what it is, that'll be kind of funny.
A really bad unicycle.
A really bad unicycle. Okay? This is a skull saw. it's a cutting edge tool for brain surgeons a while back, right? Now, if any of you needed brain surgery, my guess is that you would not gravitate toward the doctor who says, you know, it worked fine for me for years. Why should I change? Right? There are better tools for brain surgery than this cutting-edge tool of its day. So just as we don't want to simply integrate technology for technology's sake, we also don't want to fall prey to this, well, it's always worked well for me. In fact, I think there are some dangers to this, but there are also some benefits to the comparison of the profession of teaching to medical professions. I remember hearing Chris Dede from Harvard University once suggest, and this may be a bit extreme, but he suggested that to abandon or to ignore the role of technology in education will soon be the equivalent of educational malpractice. That we're not leveraging these tools that are readily available to us that can really benefit our learners. So that takes some skill though, and we're all still learning how to evaluate which tools are more or less effective. How do we avoid either of these extremes? I was at a conference at Alverno College in Milwaukee, and Alverno is known for one particular thing. They have alternative assessments. They use primarily a portfolio assessment model. You don't get letter grades in your classes, and it's throughout the entire university. It's great, except when you get one of their transcripts. It's really hard to evaluate from the perspective of students who come in there. But there was a panel discussion about the future of education and about educational technology, and one of the panelists said something that really caught my attention. After all of this great kind of theoretical, philosophical talk, a person said, okay, yeah, so what next? What do we do with all of this information that you just shared with us? And he said, well, the first thing that a teacher in the 21st century needs to do is to get informed about the possibilities. You heard mentioned in one of my other presentations, which is this idea of cultivating communities of purpose and possibility. If I were an administrator in a school and I were working with a team of teachers, the first thing that I would try to do is cultivate a community of possibility. You see, we battled some of our most significant problems, not by just focusing upon the problem, but using it to expand and to consider what the possibilities might be. When I lead a team, and for the last 6 years, I led largely an instructional design team. Right now, my team's a little bit larger. But when we bring everyone together, and we begin to brainstorm, and we begin to address things, the question that always gets thrown out is, what are the possibilities? And if you want to see my instructional design team get excited, just bring a faculty member in there and have them start with this. Is it possible, ... So get informed about the possibilities and recognize that you don't have to be the technical expert on all of these things. Find a team, a network, a collaborative that can help you with those parts where you aren't necessarily as strong. There's a great resource called Strength Finder. I don't know if you've ever filled out this leadership inventory. But the concept behind it is that you focus upon your strengths rather than devoting all of your time and energy to trying to deal with your limitations. So instead of just dealing with all of your limitations all the time, what if you focused on your strengths and you got with a team who had different strengths, and you collaborated and you explored possibilities? Here's a very practical example in my own distance learning program that we used, where the possibility mindset helped us. So we have a lot of online programs. We have 18 online programs at my university. And one of the things that we know is that student satisfaction and student learning is very, 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 very closely connected to frequent and meaningful feedback from the instructor. When they're not getting frequent and meaningful feedback in those environments, they feel isolated and their learning decreases. They feel overloaded by the technology and the content and other things like that because they're not getting any guidance. It's like playing darts blindfolded and never taking the blindfold on, right? You at least need someone to tell you whether or not you're hitting the target if you have the blindfold on. And so as we were grappling with this idea, we thought, okay, well, how are our faculty doing in this regard? Are they giving frequent and meaningful feedback? And we found out that some were, and that some were not. And interestingly enough, some of these online instructors who were not giving feedback were getting very, very positive ratings in their face-to-face classes. And so we asked, what's different here? So we did some one-on-one interviewing with faculty members in an informal, kind of non-confrontational way. And we said, so tell me a little bit about how your class is going, what's working well, how do you feel about feedback? And we also observed these teachers. And some of these teachers were the ones who hung out in the coffee shop with the students before and after class and worked with them and refined things. These were very often teachers whose best communication skill was oral communication. And then we put them in an online environment where they're stripped of their strength. So what do? You need to change. Or, what are the possibilities? So what we did is we built, I actually went to our tech guy, he's amazing, and I said, is it possible to build a tool where our oral communicators could get an assignment submitted in the Dropbox online, click record, and just talk? A week later, he came back, I have it done. So you click, an assignment can be submitted, the instructor can either grade it by rubric, can give written feedback, can download the paper, put comments in Microsoft Word, as some of you have seen, or they can just click record and say, so Mary, I'm reading your paper. You did a really great job in paragraph 1, and I'm really concerned about your conclusion though. I don't think you highlighted, whatever your feedback might be. What we found is that the instructors, these same instructors who were not giving timely feedback, or they were giving 1 or 2 sentence pieces of feedback, were now giving half to full page equivalents of feedback. They were using more examples and illustrations. The students felt more connected to the instructor. The students were more likely to use the feedback in subsequent versions of the paper, and the students were more likely to read and review the feedback multiple times if it were provided in an oral format. You see, so by using the strength finder approach and the possibility approach to integrating technology, instead of just trying to force people into one cookie cutter approach to using technology, brainstorming, looking at people's strengths, and exploring the possibilities, we came up with an amazing possibility. It was really neat because just as we were doing that, I found out the research of Dr. Phil Ice, who was a lead researcher in distance learning at American Public University, an online university of over 50,000. And this was one of his research projects, and he had just published a paper on it. And our informal findings had replicated his formal findings almost identically. In fact, I presented it at a conference, and he was in the audience, and he verified that, and that was good. If it would have not supported, it would have been a fun conversation. So get informed about the possibilities, and then also get informed about the affordances and the limitations. One of the things that you'll find, if you find yourself in a learning environment where people have different attitudes and opinions about technology, if you become a salesperson, you lose credibility. If your job is to just get the sell, you lose credibility with those other people. It's not going to help you affect positive change in that environment nearly as well as being candid about the affordances and the limitations of different technologies. I'm a big fan of Neil Postman. Neil Postman argues that every technology is a Faustian bargain, that there are benefits and limitations to it. He gives the example of when he went to buy a car, and the car salesman tried to sell him a car with cruise control. And he said, well, what are the benefits to cruise control? And the man thought, and he said, well, I've never had anyone actually ask me that question. I suppose that it keeps your foot from getting tired when you're traveling long distances. And Neil's response was, well, you know, I've been driving for years and years, and getting foot exhaustion has never been a problem for me. So I think I'll go with the no, cruise control. Except that he actually ended up getting it anyway because it was cheaper with cruise control than without. But to have those candid conversations about the affordances and the limitations and not be afraid of them. In fact, when I've tried to affect change in terms of integrating technology at the university level, one of the most effective strategies I've found is lunch. Having lunch with people and sitting down and talking about multiple sides of this. Yeah, there are some social challenges with the online world. There are some things that we want to be careful about. Are there some benefits as well? Let's look at both sides together. Because if you take that perspective and you're working with people who are really concerned about these new learning environments, what they'll soon discover is that they were salespeople for the other product. And now you put down your sales hat and you can have a good, meaningful, open, substantive conversation. Okay, so here's some examples. A really simple one, Microsoft Word. Back in the 90s, this was an example of a technology that got integrated, and then people tried to catch up and figure out, now how's this impacting writing? How did this technology impact writing? Does anyone know what some of the early research said when students first got word processors? One of the big things is they didn't edit their papers as much because it looked so good the first time. Visually. It's visually appealing, right? So it's very evident, when I write in my chicken scratch, it's very evident that this is not the final version if I write out a first draft and a second draft. Not so much in this environment. So that's a limitation that we have to overcome with retraining and some new discussion. If we just threw the technology in there and figured something good would come from it, we'd miss some of those great opportunities. How can I find articles for my history paper? That's what students are Googling. And then they might learn, oh, I guess I have to tell them what my history paper is about. And so they put that in the search, and they Google that as well. And one of the things that a search engine, in terms of affordances and limitations that online databases has done, is that it used to be that there were a couple of different perspectives going on. When you go to a library, there used to be this thing called a card catalog. Anyone? Yeah. I'm looking for one on eBay. I want to have it for my library. Different kind of library. But you would identify sources, but the job was not yet done. Then you would have to track them down, locate them, get them. Then you would analyze them, right? In the digital world, you identify and locate in one fell swoop. And that's why many of your students, when they get to the age of using databases, first thing they click when they get into the database, if you get them into the database, is full text only. I only want to see the stuff that I can read right now. The problem with that, a lot of peer-reviewed journals, if you're in the university level or some of the upper high school levels and they're using some of those, a lot of those don't get full text for between 6 and 18 months. So some of the most current research on a topic is being ignored because people have kind of assumed that you have to get it all at once. They've lost the fun of the detective work or the research. You can get that and you can reteach it, but only if we take time to explore the affordances and limitations of these new learning environments. Okay, now the second one I want to explore, I only have 3 of these, is beyond the mass production model. So there's this one-size-fits-all model that we've been talking about for quite some time. And I think most of us in this room recognize that that never really was that effective of a strategy. In fact, the one-room schoolhouse of the past was not a one-size-fits-all model. It was very customized to individual learners. And yet somewhere along the line, we began to explore these things, and we're always looking for what's scalable. And in the process of looking for what's scalable, we lose what's valuable for individual, diverse learners sometimes. So we're having conversations about things like differentiated instruction, which is a buzzword that my guess is most of you in this room are familiar with right now. So realizing the fact that individual learners may benefit from different kinds of learning experiences, different kinds of assessments may be more effective in getting at what students do or don't know, individual students do or don't know. So we're learning the benefits of customizing learning experiences for individuals. And some of the presentations later today will demonstrate some very powerful ways to differentiate. Because the first time this was introduced to teachers at conferences, they thought, this is impossible. I have 30 students. How could I possibly do this with 30 students? But now we have things like the flipped classroom or the inverted classroom, which actually makes that possible. Is there someone presenting on that concept? Oh, I think I actually have it in my presentation. Okay. I may run out of time. So I love this phrase, mass customization. So the reality is, with the one-size-fits-all mass production model, we have a lot of people to serve. And we don't have one teacher for every student, necessarily. Although you might argue, some might argue against that. You might have 50 teachers for every one student if we think about the online environments. So one way to think about this is mass customization. How can we build things that are repeatable, scalable, but they also meet the individual needs of learners. Again, some of the things you're going to hear today show that. Now, medicine is exploring this. We know that we can receive medications, and you can have one medication that works generally fairly well for a large population of people, but now there's this concept of personalized medicine. So that you literally have a medication that's based upon your genetic predispositions in order to treat people with even more effectiveness. So why not consider that in our educational environments? Here's one way that that happens.
My ultimate goal, I guess, as a teacher is to help students become learners for themselves and by themselves. One of the problems that I was guilty of prior to flipping my classroom around was the classroom was centered around me. I told them exactly what to learn, how to learn it, what assignments to do to learn it, and when to learn it, and how to prove to me that they learned it. I don't do that anymore. We changed the place in which content is delivered. Instead of standing in front of the class and delivering, here's how you do this type of problem, here's how this works, I deliver that direct instruction now asynchronously at home through these videos that we make with Camtasia Studio. Times till home.
Oh, we didn't do that last
The last step, they were already whole numbers. We had 1, 1, and 4. Here we don't have a whole number. So here's a few little tricks when you need to multiply by whole numbers. If one of your numbers ends in 0.5, you're going to multiply by 2.
Something 0.5 times it by 2.
Right.
Okay, write this down, guys.
Yes. If something ends in 0.3 or 0.33 or 0.66, you multiply by 3.
Okay, so here's an example of the flipped classroom, which allows for a kind of mass customization. So he's taking what's often done in the traditional classroom time, the chalk talk about the concept, with some Q&A and then have students do some work problems. He's putting that into a recording, which you'll see I see some different presentations that are talking about the use of iPods and different tools that can facilitate this. So students are doing that outside of class. And then when they come to class, they're doing their homework. So now the instructor is providing what's probably considered their most important role, which is that coaching, that feedback. They can wander around and give one-on-one feedback with learners as they work on their homework. And there's some really promising benefits to this. There are a number of studies. It's being done quite a bit in math curricula, but it's going into other content areas as well. So when I upload this presentation to Dropbox, I put these in here so you'll have links to them. Khan Academy is a list of pre-existing videos. That's a very popular one that people are using. So you don't always have to create the videos yourself. You may find that someone's created them for you. My guess is that pretty much every content area in this room is represented with some iTunes University or other kinds of sources on almost every level. Also, you may be familiar with the TED conferences, Technology, Entertainment, and Design. They have these phenomenal videos that just sort of stretch your mind. And they have created ed.ted.com, which is videos that you can turn into flipped classroom lessons. And that website allows you to take any YouTube video and turn it into a flipped classroom lesson. So you might want to check out that source if this captured your interest. Again, I've put some resources to some different pieces of software you could consider using, as well as some other articles. So here's one other way that we might want to think about this. We have mass customization, but another thing happening in terms of learning environments is the idea of self-directed learning. I use this over and over in presentations. I pick and choose a few slides, and I love this conversation and just what this gets us thinking about. There was a movie years ago called Click with Adam Sandler, I think, right? How many of you saw that? So the movie was Adam Sandler discovers this magic remote control, and he's able to fast forward in life, right? And he can pause things and do all sorts of interesting things with the remote. Well, let's imagine for a moment that you, in this room, you looked down on the ground, and next to you was a remote. And because you're a little bit bored with the keynote speaker, you reach down and you start playing around with it. And you see the pause button, which is what you really want to do. You really want to stop, but you don't want to be too rude. So you press pause, and I literally pause. Everything but you in the room pauses. You go to the bathroom, get some coffee, come back, click play, and it continues. Oh, I've heard this before. Fast forward. Oh, what did he say? Rewind. I'm done. Stop. You want to go to 2 sessions, and you can't make them both. Picture in picture. Right? So the possibilities are kind of interesting. Now, what's fun about it, though, is that that's starting to happen. You actually have some of those capabilities. We can design learning environments that empower students with some of these abilities. The flipped classroom model allows a student to pause and rewind and replay you over and over and over again to grasp a certain concept. Granted, they're motivated to do that, right? There is some good research, though, by the way. We find that students typically aren't going to watch videos over 10 to 15 minutes. I try to tell some of our faculty that who insist on 1 to 2 hour online lectures. Okay, so here's one example of some of the promising possibilities of self-directed learning, and this is a more extreme case. You may have seen this, some of this research by Sugata Mitra in India, where he takes a computer and puts it in a community with very little instruction or direction, and he comes back and he learns what did people learn from it. And he's written up a series of studies. He's done some fascinating studies. Do a Google search for Mitra or self-organized learning environments, SOLs, and you'll come across a couple of TED Talks. And this is one of the research articles that you might want to check out as well. TED Talk doesn't get into quite as much detail, some of his research. He also actually has a book that I'll share with you in a moment. But he asks questions like, what happens to education when you have remoteness? What happens to education in socially and economically struggling areas? These are the same areas that don't have adequate infrastructure, and it's hard to keep good teachers. That was the problem he was going to address. So he thought, okay, well, let's see if they can teach themselves. Let me give them some resources and see what they do with it. And he had some phenomenal results. In fact, these were students who did not know English, and they were learning things in English. So the relative impact of educational technology, he found, is greater for the most disadvantaged students. Now here's a serious problem I think we have in our educational systems, though. What are the school systems with the least amount of technology? The very school systems where students could most benefit from it. And one of the reasons that people suspect that this is true is because students in more affluent areas often have more technology readily available throughout their entire life experience, at home and community and other places. So even if they didn't see it, experience a lot in the classroom, they would still be developing some of these fluencies just because they're exposed to it a significant amount of time, for a significant amount of time. And yet some of them are disadvantaged schools, they're not getting that. This is going to involve some creative solutions for us. And Sugata Mitra gives one of those. The Hole in the Wall is a book. You can buy it on Amazon or other places as well. But if you want to read a pretty accessible version of his story, that's what you'll find it under The Hole in the Wall. Over 300 children computer literate in 6 months. Okay, I could take you through a bunch of other examples too, but there's some really interesting things happening with self-organized learning environments and also with self-directed learning. This is the newest massive open online course. You can actually sign up for and take this course right now. It's in progress, but you can jump in. It's by Curtis Bonk in Indiana, and Curtis wrote a book called The World is Open, and he has an entire online course that's freely available. You don't get credit for it, but you learn from it. And there are people experimenting with these massive courses that make learning accessible to people. You may have heard of some things like Udemy, which people can create and teach courses online for free. Some universities are doing it as well. The new partnership between Harvard University and MIT to offer free or inexpensive online courses, although their primary goal is actually to do research on the students and to figure out what works and what doesn't. So we have a lot of really interesting experiments happening. P2PU. You can check that one out. Do a Google search. Peer-to-peer university. Anyone can create a course and you can take it and you can learn from one another. What if our schools even started doing that? There are some schools that are experimenting with students teaching courses, and the teacher serves as a guide and a resource and keeps them on track. And you could actually use some of these pre-developed online environments to do that. So third one is beyond learning objectives and standards to immersive learning environments. Now this one may be a little more controversial to some people in the room. I'm not saying that learning objectives and standards are bad or wrong. In fact, they're very, very helpful. However, Suppose that was the primary focus. And as soon as your students were able to demonstrate 85% competency related to a learning objective, you moved on. One of the problems that we would find is that retention might not be there. They might not experience deep learning. Most of the things that we're best at, we don't get best at it because we work on it until we're just good enough, we take a test, we demonstrate competence, and then we move on. Instead, there are things that we spend significant amounts of time on. The digital world is not beneficial because, the tools aren't beneficial because they give us shortcuts to learning, but because they can draw us into even more of immersive learning. It takes more time. In fact, I joked when I came to my university, I said, if you guys are hiring me, you got to understand, I'm going to make things take longer and cost more money. It's the initial investment of the technology. But take longer. I want students to spend more time learning, slow learning, getting caught in the experience. So one thing we find, for example, with students from disadvantaged populations is one of the reasons they struggle is even if you have a great school curriculum and they're assessing very well, they struggle when they get into higher education or they get into their first jobs because they weren't in immersive discourse. Sometimes we talk about in discourse analysis, the difference between Germanic and Latinate discourse. So I grew up, I'm a first-generation college student. I grew up in a home that spoke entirely Germanic, not German, Germanic, kind of sort of everyday language. I didn't know how to communicate concepts or ideas using a Latinate kind of discourse. And so I was at a significant disadvantage in formal learning environments until I cultivated that more. That took a significant amount of time. It took me years to figure out how to use a semicolon. I think I know now. But so the benefit of being immersed in that environment and that experience for an extended period of time, and that goes beyond just shooting for learning objectives and standards. That's why there's some these are older books, but check it out. Just do a Google search or a search on your favorite bookseller online, and you'll find tons of books about what educators can learn from video games. Because they're immersive environments. I'm not saying we necessarily have to use games, although we can, but we can take the principles of games to design some phenomenal learning experience. So they can lead us to spending more time, to over-learning, not just repetition, mindless repetition, but coming to understand something and being so intrigued and fascinated by it that we keep coming back to it over and over and over and over again. We want to repeat it, explore it, and that leads to a deeper learning that lasts longer. You get longer-term retention. I have some schools that I've been visiting. I just finished a 1.5-year-long study of innovative schools, and I came away with a set of 10 principles that were evident in every leader of every one of these innovative schools. These 10 characteristics were always present. These administrators, by the way, are sometimes hard to work for, but they resource you really well. High expectations, but high support. So I visited some. This is George D. Warner in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and this is KM Global in Kettle Moraine High School. It's just west of Milwaukee. These are two examples of project-based learning high schools. This second one is done by an instructor that I just hired to teach a course called Innovation in Education. She has 2 earned doctorates, and her second doctorate went around to research and development institutes in different companies, the R&D centers at different top-notch companies, and she observed and interviewed the people who are thriving in those environments. And she figured out these are the competencies, the skills that are evident from these people, in these people. Now, how can I build a high school that cultivates those skills? And she came away with a model for a project-based learning school. And it's phenomenal to walk in and to have these students talk about their projects. There was one student who studied the Aztec culture using Howard Gardner's theories of multiple intelligence in order to honor their diverse skills in that culture, because he came from a vacation and he saw a lot of people with negative stereotypes about this culture, so he wanted to overcome it by using Howard Gardner's model, sophomore in high school. There was another girl whose parents were dog breeders, and she was building an entire business model for them and building a social network online to help them connect with the other dog breeders and expand their business internationally. There was another girl who was a dancer, and she wanted to be a surgeon, so she combined the two, and she did a semester-long study of injuries related to dance and studied the human body. So she had a coach from the biology department, she had her dance instructor, she had the English instructor who coached her, and she was able to get credit in these different content areas by demonstrating her competencies in these projects. Phenomenal stuff. Some great possibilities. Now, I'm not suggesting that we take all of our schools, throw them away, and build project-based learning schools in their place. But I think we can look at these more extreme examples and take away some great lessons. And that's what you're going to get in a lot of the presentations, today. Now, I'm not going to share this presentation, this next slide with you. It's a link to a SlideShare slide. But I would argue that when it all comes down to it, the optimal learning environment of the future is one that asks the best question in the world. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're going to have to go to Dropbox, find my presentation, and click on this link, and you'll find it. The final one that we'll finish with here is beyond the classroom. You're going to learn about a variety of technologies today that extend the learning environment well beyond a room with 4 walls. You're going to learn about how we can bring the learning experience into the community, into the digital world around the globe. And that is an exciting possibility. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to I don't know if we have time. Do you want to leave the time for a few minutes? I'll stop and give you guys a chance to ask a few questions. But then you'll get to go into the breakout sessions and get into the nuts and bolts of this.